I need to say this up front, because I know exactly how this sounds. Another tech guy switching to Linux and making a video about it. But stay with me for a second, because this isn't a Linux fanboy pitch, and I'm not here to tell you Windows is garbage. I use Windows 11 every single day for years. My whole setup, my muscle memory, every shortcut I never think about anymore, all of it was built around it. Switching felt like a project I didn't have time for, so I kept finding reasons to put it off. And then a D8 on a calendar forced my hand in a way I wasn't expecting. And what happened after that genuinely changed how I think about Teehee operating system I use every day. Here's the actual timeline, because the dates matter more than people realize. Windows 10 hit end of mainstream support on October 14, 2025. After that date, standard Windows 10 editions stopped getting the routine security patches and quality updates that had kept them safe for a decade. Microsoft's answer was the Extended Security Updates program. And here's where it gets interesting, because the terms actually shifted midstream. Originally, consumer ESU was framed as a strict one-year bridge, ending October 13th, 2026. But according to reporting from Windows Latest and confirmed directly by Microsoft, the company quietly extended that consumer coverage window all the way to October 12th, 2027, giving home users an extra year they weren't originally promised. I said, on paper that sounds generous. In practice, it's still a countdown. You're either handing over Microsoft account sign-in, opting into Windows backup, or spending rewards points just to keep getting patched on an operating system the company has already declared finished. That's not longevity. That's a subscription to borrowed time on a product they've moved on from. So why not just upgrade to Windows 11 and be done with it? Because Windows 11's hardware requirements, specifically TPM 2.0 and a fairly recent CPU floor, cut a massive number of working PCs out of eligibility entirely. Dell executives previously put the global Windows PC installed base at roughly 1.5 billion machines, with somewhere around 500 million of those technically eligible for Windows 11 but never upgraded, and another 500 million simply locked out at the hardware level. Sit with that. 500 million computers that still boot fine, still browse fine, still run a spreadsheet without complaint, disqualified from the current version of their own operating system because of a firmware checkbox they were never designed around. As of mid-2, 0.26, stat counter data still shows a meaningful share of the global Windows install base sitting on Windows 10 months after TS official support cutoff, which tells you this isn't a fringe problem. It's a genuinely massive ongoing migration crisis, PL, playing out in real time. That was the backdrop when I finally decided to make the jump myself. And I'll be honest about the part nobody likes, admit it, D on camera. The fear wasn't about Linux as some abstract idea. It was about disruption. You spend years building a workflow. You know exactly where your files live, which app opens, which file type, which keyboard shortcut. Saves you 30 seconds, 50. 5 times a day without you even noticing you're doing it. The idea of throwing that away for something unfamiliar felt like a co-cité. I genuinely wasn't ready to absorb. What I didn't understand yet was that I was already absorbing a different cost every CNGuel day. And I'd normalized it so completely that it had become invisible to me. Let me describe what daily life on Windows 11 had quietly turned into. Because if you're watching this, there's a good chance you'll recognize it instantly. Update-driven reboots landing once or twice a week, each one eating 15 to 20 minutes at SOM point you didn't choose. Background telemetry and system processes idling in the mid-single digits of CPU usage before you. I've opened a single application. Stack that up across a year and you're realistically looking at somewhere around 40 to 50 hours lost purely to your operating system's own maintenance schedule, not counting the mental tax of losing your train of thought every time a restart prompt appears at the worst possible moment. That's more than a full work week handed over annual. Lie, because the OS decided its priorities came before yours. I started actually tracking this after reading similar estimates, Ellie. And, which I'm going to go deep on later in this video, because what I found there is the part that actually shifted how I think. This is the environment that led me in early 2026 to install Linux Mint 22.3, codenamed Xena, the long-term support release, that landed in January 2026 and is supported all the way through April 2029, built on top of Ubuntu 24.04 LTS. And within about 48 hours, something clicked that I'd known intellectually for years, but had genuinely never felt. No telemetry running. In the background by default, no forced Microsoft account tied to my login, no advertising baked into the start menu, just an operating system quietly doing what I told it to do, and nothing more. That first morning at the desktop, realizing nothing, as phoning home in the background felt strange in a way I wasn't prepared for. Not bad strange, just unfamiliar after year. And I want to be clear, this isn't just me and a handful of enthusiasts having a moment on the internet. The Windows 10 cutoff has created one of the clearest inflection points the desktop market has seen in years, with everyone from budget-conscious households to small businesses testing Linux instead of buying new hardware or paying to stay on a deprecated OS. Depending on which tracker you check, Linux, as global desktop share, has been sitting in the low single digits through 2026, but Steam's own hardware survey has recorded Linux gaming usage pushing past the 5% mark earlier this year, a record high for the platform. That might sound small until you run the math against a global PC user base measured in the billions. That's tens of millions of people making roughly the same decision I did around roughly the same window of time. Going in, the question I kept circling back to was simple. Is the difference actually dramatic, or is this just different for the sake of being different? Now that I've spent real months on the other side, I can give you a straight answer. It's not subtle, it's dramatic, and this next part is exactly why. The first thing that hits you is boot time, and not in some marginal, barely noticeable way. In a way that makes you wonder what Windows was actually doing during all those minutes you spent staring at a spinning logo. On my machine, a mid-range laptop with an 8th generation Intel Core i5, 8GB of RAM, and a standard SSD, Windows 11 was consistently taking 55 seconds to over a minute to reach a genuinely usable desktop. Not the moment the wallpaper appears while background processes are still quietly loading behind it. Linux Mint, on that exact same hardware, reaches a fully usable desktop in under 20 seconds. That's not a benchmark stat sitting in a spreadsheet somewhere. You feel that gap every single morning before you've had coffee. And boot time turns out to be the least dramatic part of the story. RAM usage is where at 2 to 3 gigabytes of RAM used before you've opened a single application. Linux Mint running the Cinnamon desktop idles somewhere around 500 megabytes to a gigabyte on identical hardware. On my specific 8GB machine, Windows was sitting around 2.8 gigabyte at idle, while Mint sat around 700 milder. That's not a minor efficiency win. That's your operating system handing back almost 2 full gigabytes of memory it was previously consuming without ever explaining why. In practice, that means when I open a dozen browser tabs, a document, and a video player simultaneously on Linux, the system doesn't even register the load. Do the same thing on Windows 11, and I'd watch RAM climb towards 7 gigabytes with the exact kind of lag that comes from a system running out of headroom. Now let's talk about hardware compatibility, because this is where a lot of you have a legitimate, reasonable worry, and I want to be precise rather than dismissive here. When I first booted the Mint Live USB, I was honestly braced for the classic horror stories. Wi-Fi not detected, GPU conflicts, a touchpad behaving like it's possessed. Those stories are real, but they're mostly 5 or 6 years old at this point in Linux's development. What actually happened on my machine? Wi-Fi connected on first boot, audio worked immediately, display resolution was correct out of the gate, touchpad gestures worked without configuration. The only manual step was installing the proprietary NVIDIA driver and Mint's built-in driver manager. Handled that in about 4 minutes with a single click. Where you can still hit friction in 2026 is on brand new or niche hardware, certain Broadcom Wi-Fi chips, some gaming peripherals, and the very latest GPU architectures where Windows drivers still land first. But for machines that have been in service for 2 to 8 years, which describes the overwhelming majority of people's laptops, the hardware experience is honestly unremarkable. And unremarkable is exactly what you want from an operating system. The update experience might be the single biggest quality of life difference of the entire switch. On Windows 11, updates happen to you. The system decides when to download, often while you're actively using your bandwidth for something else, then drops a restart prompt at the worst possible moment, and if you decline it enough times, it eventually just does it anyway. On Linux Mint, the update manager notifies you, and you decide when to apply updates. Reboots are almost never required for routine package updates. In months of daily use, I've rebooted for a kernel update maybe twice, both times on my own. Schedule, not the system's. And on the software question, the old assumption that switching means giving up your tools is mostly outdated at this point. LibreOffice opens Word, Excel, and PowerPoint files cleanly. Firefox and Chromium run natively. Spotify, Discord, Zoom, and VLC all ship native Linux clients. DaVinci Resolve has a fully featured Linux build. Microsoft itself even ships VS Code for Linux, and Microsoft 365 works fine through any modern browser. The real gap left today is narrow. Adobe's Creative Suite, certain CAD platforms, and games running kernel-level anti-cheat. If none of those define your day-to-day workflow, there's a real chance you won't notice the gap at all. Now let us talk about privacy, because I think this is genuinely the most underreported part of the entire conversation, and I say that as someone who already considered myself reasonably informed going in. When I actually sat down and looked at what Windows 11 sends out of a machine through Microsoft's own Documentation and independent privacy write-ups rather than any conspiracy forum. The picture that came together was uncomfortable. I wasn't prepared for how far it actually went. Start with what Microsoft openly admits, because even the officially disclosed version is enough to make you pause. Out of the box, Windows 11 sends diagnostic telemetry on your device, your installed apps, your usage patterns, and guides published in 2026 describe it more bluntly. Windows treats your PC as a telemetry pipeline feeding both advertising and AI training infrastructure, unless you actively go in and configure it otherwise. Required diagnostic data can't be turned off at all on consumer editions. Optional diagnostic data can be reduced, but it's not a single switch. It's scattered across half a dozen settings pages that most people will never find, which honestly feels like the point. Then there's recall, which is still arguably the most contested feature Microsoft has shipped in years. Recall is the Copilot Plus feature that periodically screenshots your screen and indexes the content so you can later search your own activity history in natural language. When it was first announced back in 2024, the backlash was intense enough that Microsoft delayed the rollout by a full year and reworked how it stored data. It eventually shipped on Copilot Plus hardware, requiring explicit opt-in, Windows Hello authentication, and local rather than cloud storage of snapshots. And here's the part that actually surprised me digging into 2026 coverage. Reporting from earlier this year indicates Microsoft internally considers the current recall implementation something close to a failure, and has been reviewing whether to rework or even rename the feature entirely, rather than simply expanding it further. Even on standard, non-Copilot Plus Windows 11 systems that never had recall explicitly enabled, the underlying framework is reportedly present in a dormant state. It's not that the feature works perfectly, it's that the instinct to build a continuous, searchable visual log of everything on your screen in the first place tells you a lot about the direction the product philosophy is heading. That direction, at least on paper, has been quietly walked back this year. In March 2026, multiple outlets reported that Microsoft shelved plans to extend Copilot further into the notification center, and several other lightweight system surfaces after internal telemetry and insider preview feedback showed real user frustration at unsolicited AI prompts and persistent nudges. That's worth acknowledging, because it complicates a purely everything is getting worse narrative. Microsoft is clearly hearing some of the backlash, but complicating it further, other 2026 reporting describes Copilot integration as effectively impossible to fully remove from certain Office apps, with the option to disable it disappearing in some builds where it previously existed as a simple checkbox. So, you end up with a genuinely mixed picture. Some retreat on the most visible AI surfaces, alongside a tightening grip on others. Not a clean story in either direction, which is exactly why it's worth explaining rather than oversimplifying. Then there's the part that's easy to gloss over because it's less flashy than Recall Edge and Bing integration baked directly into core OS behavior. Windows search results get pulled from Bing, regardless of your default search engine. The Start menu nudges you toward Edge even when you've set another browser as default. Clipboard content can sync through a Microsoft account in ways that persist even after you think you've turned related settings off. None of this is a bug. Multiple 2026 privacy guides describe it plainly as deliberate design, the kind of default that quietly assumes you'd rather not bother opting out because most people won't. What genuinely surprised me in the other direction is that a handful of apps I use daily actually ran more stably on Linux than they ever did on Windows. And that's a part of this conversation that doesn't come up nearly often enough. Overall system stability, the kind where you stop thinking about the OS entirely because it's just quietly doing its job, was consistently better than what I'd normalized on Windows without ever realizing I'd normalized it. On Linux Mint, there's no telemetry pipeline running by default, no advertising identifier tied to your login, no Bing results forced into a local file search, no Copilot nudging you mid-document to improve something you didn't ask about. It's not that Linux is free of any data collection whatsoever. Package managers and some default apps do check for updates, but the entire philosophy is opt-in rather than assumed, transparent rather than buried 6 settings pages deep. So here's where I actually land on this, months into daily use. This isn't a nostalgia trip, and it isn't a purist stance dressed up as a tech review. It's simply this, an operating system that boots in under 20 seconds instead of a full minute, that idles at under a gigabyte of RAM instead of nearly 3, that lets you decide when to reboot instead of deciding for you, and that doesn't quietly turn your daily habits into advertising inventory or AI training data. That's not a marginal upgrade sitting somewhere in the fine print of a spec sheet. That's a fundamentally different relationship with the machine you sit in front of every single day. And the timing here genuinely isn't abstract anymore. Windows 10 mainstream support ended back on October 14th, 2025. Microsoft's own consumer ESU coverage after being quietly extended earlier this year, now runs through October 12, 2027, according to the company's updated documentation. That sounds like breathing room, and in a sense it is, but it's still a bridge with a stated end date, not a destination. If you're one of the roughly 500 million machines that Windows 11 has effectively ruled ineligible on hardware grounds, or you're simply tired of an operating system that treats your attention and your behavioral data as something to be monetized by default, that bridge is worth thinking about now rather than in the final months before it closes. I also want to be straight with you about the parts of this that aren't a clean win, because a genuinely honest take has to include them. Gaming with kernel-level anti-cheat is still a real gap. Some competitive titles simply won't run properly under Linux yet, and if that's your primary use case, you need to check your specific games against something like ProtonDB before you commit to anything. Adobe's Creative Suite still doesn't have a native Linux build, so if your work depends on Premiere or Photoshop specifically, rather than an alternative, that's friction you'll actually hit, not a hypothetical. Certain CAD platforms sit in the same category, and on brand new laptops with the very latest chipsets, you may occasionally have to wait a little longer for Linux driver support to fully catch up to what ships with Windows on day one. None of that is Linux being fundamentally broken. It's Linux being a smaller ecosystem in a handful of specific identifiable categories, and it's worth knowing exactly which categories those are before you decide whether they apply to you. What struck me most, looking back at the whole process, is how much of my original hesitation was really just inertia wearing the costume of a technical concern. I told myself for years that switching would be complicated, that I'd lose compatibility, that I'd spend a weekend troubleshooting Wi-Fi drivers instead of actually working. In practice, on hardware that's been in service for a normal, live in a much narrower set of places than the reputation suggests. And once you know where those places are, you can make an actual informed decision instead of an anxious guess. There's also something worth sitting with in the privacy side of this story specifically, separate from the performance numbers. Microsoft walking back some of its more aggressive Copilot surfaces this year, while simultaneously making certain integrations harder to fully remove elsewhere, tells you the company is getting real pressure and responding to some of it unevenly. That's not a reason to assume everything's fixed. It's a reason to keep paying attention because the direction of travel over the last 2 years has consistently been toward more embedded AI, more cloud-dependent processing, and more data leaving your device by default, even as individual controversial features occasionally get walked back under public pressure. An operating system that has to be manually locked down, setting by setting, feature update by feature update, just to get back to a baseline most users assumed they already had, is telling you something about its default posture. If you're sitting on one of those hundreds of millions of machines Windows 11 has quietly ruled too old to matter, or you're just tired of an OS that treats your attention as inventory, I genuinely encourage you to grab a spare USB drive, download the Linux Mint 22.3 ISO, and try the live session before installing anything permanently. You lose nothing by testing it. Boot from the USB, check them. Identical to mine, and it shouldn't be treated as if it is. It took me years of putting this decision off before an external deadline finally forced my hand. You don't need to wait for a deadline of your own. You can just try it this weekend on a spare drive. If this actually helped you understand what switching looks like in practice, drop a comment with your own setup. I genuinely want to know what's still keeping people on Windows in 2026, whether it's habit, specific software, or something I haven't covered here. And if you found this useful, subscribe, because I'm planning a full follow-up walking through the actual step-by-step migration process, backup strategy, and a safe dual boot setup for anyone who wants a safety net before going all in. See you in the next one.